In a previous video, I analyzed John Donne's poem, The Flea, and in that video, I couldn't talk about every last scholarly issue, or at least not in great depth. So in this bonus video, I just want to talk about a couple of critical readings of the issue of gender in the poem. And these critical readings will be very different from each other, and I think they can be seen as a little bit of a cautionary tale in terms of how we should not read too much into the poem, or at least we should be very careful that we don't push the analogy too far. So before I talk about the first one here, Thomas Docherty's John Donne Undone, fairly influential book from 1986, I just want to think a little bit about this notion of analogy. How do we think about analogies like metaphors, similes, comparisons, stories even? And to think about this, I'd like to use Montaigne, a Renaissance writer, who wrote a very famous essay called On Experience, or Of Experience, I forget the exact name. But this is in his collected essays. It's typically the last essay. And he says if you use an analogy, you have kind of two things that you are comparing, okay? And Montaigne is a little bit skeptical about how we compare these things. So he says these two things tend to have a corner of similarity to them. So these two things might be similar to each other, but a lot of the rest of 1 and 2, these things are actually different. And maybe an example would be easier here. If, for instance, I say to you, you are a lion on the battlefield, then this is the lion, this is you, and I'm only comparing a little bit of the lion to you, right? Maybe the fierce part. I want you to be as brave and fierce as a lion. But I'm not saying anything about the fact that lions sleep up to 20 hours a day, or that the lion has a shaggy mane. I'm not comparing those things to you. And if I did, I would have to use maybe a different comparison or extend the comparison and make that clear. So Montaigne then says, every example limps, it goes lame. Tout exemple cloche. It just doesn't always work smoothly. And Montaigne is so skeptical, he says, why should I look at the life of Julius Caesar when I could just look at my own experience and learn from that? So he kind of becomes very skeptical about analogies. Now, I raise this because if you think about the flea, first of all, John Donne himself uses an analogy, right? The situation with the flea is similar to what's happening to us, and so we need to compare these things. But in that case as well, we need to, first of all, be careful about all this other stuff. How far do we push the implications of what else a flea is and what happens in this scenario? And should we also be careful introducing other analogies? So our first example then, Thomas Docherty's book, John Donne Undone, it introduces the idea of a telescope. And Docherty argues that in the same way that a telescope allows you to zoom in and zoom out and changes the perception of what is small and what is big, in the same way the poem zooms in and out a lot. It moves from this tiny little flea to references to the Trinity, to cloisters, all sorts of different contexts. And I think that part has some merit. So other scholars have talked about not the telescope, but the microscope, which is fair enough as well. You can think about that. So I'm not opposed to this idea that the telescope has some bearing on the poem, but it's what Thomas Docherty does with this that takes it to the next level, because he starts to suggest that there is a kind of analogy between the telescope and the phallus. And by phallus, we just mean penis, so this is sort of a fancy word for that. Now, do we really think that these two things are similar? The telescope is never mentioned in the poem. The phallus isn't really overtly either. So somehow we start to compare these two things and we say this is what the poem is about. And I think we really should start to already have some questions about this, right? So he argues then that this analog, right? Analog is a comparison. Something is comparable, similar to an analogy. This explains notions of phallic potency. In other words, the poem is about a man who wants to show his dominance and stay in control. So this reading is very much focused on masculinity and power and dominance. Now, what Docherty argues then is that there's this sort of scopophiliac and phallic control over the other, and the other is the lady. Scopophiliac means having sexual pleasure in looking, and in the same way that you look through a telescope, somehow the penis also wants control over the other, or the penis represents masculinity, and you want to have control over the lady. He goes on, and we'll just kind of skip ahead a little bit here. He says, "Oh, stay," if you think about the second stanza then, remember that what we have there is the ladies wanting to kill the flea, and John Donne says, "Stop, right? Don't kill the flea." But now all of a sudden, this takes on a different meaning according to Docherty, because this is part of the sexual act. Stop means like, don't go too fast. I don't want to have a sexual climax yet, right? And then we have these two kinds of ejaculations. Well, three really. You have this kind of verbal ejaculation early on, or a nonverbal ejaculation, which suggests, stop, don't go too fast. And then also a seminal ejaculation, which in this case is actually the semen coming out and things like that. So it's kind of like, hey, I'm not ready to come yet. I need to stay in control somehow. But is that really what the poem is about at that point? Because the lady is just threatening to kill the flea. Okay, so we really have to read the flea in such a way then that this is saying, stop, slow down, but they're not having sex yet. Donne is trying to argue that they should have sex, so it's not really a sexual situation. It's just trying to kill a flea. You can see then that most people would not read this sexually at all. They would just say, okay, well, stop, don't kill the flea. It takes a lot of work to get to that next level of saying, well, this is somehow about slowing down the act of ejaculation. Let's skip ahead here. So in the same way that the telescope allows you to control space, right, outer space, so the female outer space also needs to be controlled, and this happens through the phallus somehow. So increasingly, we get this sense that the two objects, the penis and the telescope, do things that are similar. The telescope controls outer space, and the penis somehow controls the woman, the other. And this happens through different things. So if you look at this particular paragraph here, he says, first of all, it happens through increased knowledge of space. Right? The telescope allows you to master the world around you because you start to understand it. You can see the stars, you can see lots of different things, and you have a sense of what outer space is. But does that really apply to the penis, like increased knowledge of space? I'm a little skeptical. It also says it works to control space by extending itself into the environment in a sense. I love that, in a sense. It's like, well, let's not go too far with this, but you do have to believe me. So extending itself into the environment, well, again, applies to a telescope, right? You have to extend it in order to see. People do talk about the penis as a third leg, I suppose, but does it really extend into the world in order to understand the world? I don't think men use their sexual instruments for that particular purpose. And you might as well say that something like a hat, if you wear a hat, it extends into the world, and so it allows you to know space. It's just kind of a ludicrous argument to push it this far. Thirdly, it is instrumental in the acquisition of powers of prediction and authority. This has to do with knowledge again. So the telescope allows you to predict, to make measurements and things like that, gives you authority. Does that apply? Very, very loosely. Okay, so finally he says then, this works to suggest that the human self is primarily male, and that anything which does not cohere with this male-oriented notion of selfhood is a deviation, and so on and so forth. In other words, the poem is all about establishing masculine control by means of the penis, which is similar to the telescope, and the lady is just there to kind of create a sense of masculine self. Interesting reading, totally over the top, I would say, and it really teaches us, again, to be kind of cautious with these analogies, especially if we make up one that's not even in the poem and then suggest that it is the overriding analogy for the poem. The second example I'll have a look at is Gina Filo's article, Gender, Genre, and Donne's The Flea. This one is a little bit more convincing, I think. It has some interesting points, but basically it argues that the flea, right, the flea, because it sucks both their bloods, so both the male blood and the female blood, it starts to become kind of gender fluid. So there's this gender fluid idea because it takes on multiple kind of sexual positions in the poem. Now, I think we have to be, again, careful with this because she focuses a lot, for instance, on penetration. And she's very careful to say, well, penetration is not inherently or exclusively a male sexual act, because then we run into the danger of what's called essentialism, which is where you say, well, the essence of masculinity is this, or this thing is essentially masculine. And in terms of gender criticism, that's kind of a suspect move. But she still nevertheless wants to argue that penetration is a male phenomenon in this poem, or at least to start. And so she tries to read it into all kinds of different things. You should take a step back at this point and think, well, does the poem talk about penetration? The word isn't used, and it says the flea sucks, right? The two of them. Is sucking their blood penetration? Well, it needs to bite, presumably, and then it sucks things up. But again, right, penetration isn't really an obvious term to use for this particular action. In order to make this work, then, she relies on this similarity between sucked and the F word, which we talked about in our first video, and which we discussed as maybe somewhat dubious idea, or at least a stretch. I talked to a Shakespearean colleague of mine who didn't feel that reading was particularly convincing. It's maybe there a little bit, but you'd have to stretch it. Okay, so it's dependent on that. When she reads specific lines, I think she also kind of overdoes it. So she says, the evocation of a maidenhead which the flea enjoys. It doesn't say that the flea enjoys her maidenhead. It could bite her anywhere, really. It says, thou knowest that this cannot be said, right, this sucking of her blood, this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead. So in other words, it doesn't say that she is, or that the flea is enjoying her maidenhead. It's saying, you did not lose your maidenhead when the flea sucked you, and the flea sucking you is similar to sexuality, but of course it is not sexuality specifically. Otherwise, the poet would have what he's asking for. So again, we have to be careful about the way we phrase things and not push things too far. Moving on then, she suggests that the flea here, sorry, I'm going a bit too far, the flea becomes a bit like a hermaphrodite, right, having two sexes in one. And yes, I can see that a little bit, this sense of the flea becoming this kind of figure, or this kind of sense where the two come together, right, where they are one. But as we saw before, this has other resonances as well. So there's the Eucharist, the joining, the communion. And why do we need to read this in terms of gender more than something like that? How do we know, as the comparison goes, what the most important point of comparison is? That can be definitely tricky. I think you can also agree with Filo that some things do seem a little bit more masculine or feminine, maybe. He wants to be pampered, he says, like the flea. But again, we should say, well, if before she had said that penetration is not specifically a male thing, and we may question that, then what about being pampered? Certainly anybody likes to be pampered. So we have to be super careful not to read too much into the poem. Perhaps the weakest part of this is this section here where it says, when she kills the flea is penetrated, bleeds, and dies, with an implicit sexual pun on death, because the sexual climax was often referred to as the little death in this period. But it doesn't say that the lady penetrates the flea. It says that she kills it with her finger, which is purpled, right, by blood. And you could say, well, she's just kind of squeezing or crushing the flea. But is she really penetrating it with her nail? That seems a very unusual kind of verb to be using for killing the flea. And that's where I get lost in this argument. I just think it's pushing it way too far to say at this point, the lady is penetrating, she is in control, and we have every gender position in this poem. So I raise this as another example of taking analogies and pushing them too far. We can read the poem in terms of gender. There's a lot to say for it. But as you can see, by comparing these two readings, one reading said this is all about masculinity. The other reading said this is all about gender fluidity. And because the analogy is so open, it's very easy to read either one into the poem. But as I've suggested, both of them are a little bit of a stretch. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this bonus video. Sometimes it's good to see the limits of interpretation so that we don't push things too far.